This is Bob Brooks, host of the Prudent Money Radio Show. Just got off the air with Dan Pilla. He's our IRS expert. Written probably 16, 17 books. I've lost count, but probably knows more about the IRS than anybody, and is often asked to consult and play some pretty big roles in trying to figure things out with the IRS. Today, he came on the program to talk a little bit about dealing with the IRS, the basics, what you need to know. I had a long list of questions to ask, and we got through about a third of it, and I'll probably be continuing this conversation next month. But hope you enjoy it. I hope it helps you out. If you got a question for me, and or if you need any help from a financial advisor, because I am one, you can go to prudentmoney.com and check out the information on on my background and what I do. But you can also send me an email at info@prudentmoney.com, or just go into the Q&A up to the top of the page and send a message, and we'll get you taken care of. This is Bob Brooks. Keep the faith.
This is Alistair Begg of Truth for Life, heard daily and weekends on Bible School Radio, 91.3 KDKR, Decatur, Dallas, Fort Worth, and on 91.3 KYJC Commerce.
Portions of KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, how do you deal with the IRS? Today we're going to talk some basics. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, what are the basics of dealing with the IRS that you need to know about? IRS expert Dan Pilla is here, as he is every month, to talk about what you need to know. Hey, Dan, what's going on today?
Hey, Bob, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. I was thinking about our time together, and I thought to myself, there's so many crazy stories to be talking about, and we managed to cover them. We never take a program and just go over some of the basics and how to deal with the IRS, because there's chances are you may fall into that situation where you got to deal with them.
Sure, yeah, you're right. It happens all the time. I mean, just for example, the IRS mails out about 100 million notices every year to taxpayers, letters and notices and contact. 100 million, Bob.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Every single year, and that's a lot. And you keep it in context. There's only about 160 million tax returns filed, so 100 million notices going out. Now, certainly, a lot of people receive more than one notice, so it's not like 100 million individual people getting notices. But still, I mean, we're talking tens of millions of people.
Yes.
That get these letters from the IRS that often are confused and just don't know what to do about them.
Well, and the thing is, what those letters do create is a bunch of fear, and knowing they're going to have to deal with the IRS. Something that you and I have been doing radio together for over 20 years, and the one thing that you always reassure people with and tell people is you don't have to fear the IRS, that there are processes and protections actually afforded to the taxpayer. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's no question about that, Bob. And let's just talk about the collection notices for just a second, because those are really the ones that terrify people. Dear taxpayer, you owe us $10,000. You better send in the money or else. And they read these letters and they see the words penalties and interest and levies and liens and seizures and asset for and all these terms that do exactly what you just said. They confuse people and they terrify people, and they put the letter down and they're not sure what they're supposed to do, but they're absolutely sure that they're frightened about what's going to happen next. And so it's very important to understand how these collection notices work. And to start with that process, let's start with the basics of collection. The IRS has collection powers that include lien, levy, and seizure. There's no doubt about that. But they cannot use those tools, Bob, unless they first mail to the citizen a letter known as a final notice, notice of intent to levy, and notice of your right to a hearing. That's called a final notice letter, and it says, dear taxpayer, you owe us X dollars. We've previously sent you requests for payment. You haven't paid. Now this is your final notice of intent to levy and notice of your right to a hearing. You have to pay us X dollars by X date, or you have the right to file an appeal. Now, Bob, here's the key. People read the lien levy seizure part, but they never read the appeal part. They don't get that far in the letter because they
Right.
shut down emotionally
Sure.
when they see the lien levy and seizure language, right? You need to get to the next paragraph that talks about the right to appeal, because the appeal process the IRS is mentioning in that notice is called a collection due process appeal. This is probably the single most important right that taxpayers have when dealing with the IRS. This right was created with the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act way back in the late 90s. And what this does is when you execute a collection due process appeal, it's a simple form, and they include the form in the letter. That's the irony, is the form is right there in the final notice letter. You don't have to go digging around for it. It's right there in the letter. The instructions for the form are right there in the letter. It's pretty simple. You fill the form out, you send it back, you get it sent back by the deadline, which is 30 days. They express the deadline right in the notice, so there's no confusion. If you get that letter back to the IRS within the proper time frame, three things happen. Three very important things. Number one, you shut down collection entirely. The IRS can't seize a postage stamp from you, Bob, until your case goes through the appeals process. So that's number one. Number two, the case gets assigned to the IRS Office of Appeals. The Office of Appeals is the function of the IRS that provides the hearing opportunity for taxpayers that challenge IRS action. In this case, we're challenging collection action. So the appeals office has as their written job description, Bob, to negotiate settlements with taxpayers. Right? So the collection people, the ones that are trying to get the money, their job is to cause problems with taxpayers. The appeals office, their job is to solve problems with taxpayers. So which one would you rather deal with?
Sure.
So all right, so that's the second thing that happens. The third thing that happens is in the appeals process, the appeals office has an affirmative duty to consider collection alternatives that are proposed by the taxpayer. All right, so the collection alternatives, what does that mean? Well, real simple. The IRS sends you a final notice. Let's say you owe them $20,000. They send you the final notice. They say, we want the $20,000 and we want it now. And you say, well, I can't pay it now. I need an alternative to full payment. Maybe the alternative is an installment agreement. Maybe it's an offer in compromise. Maybe it's penalty relief. Maybe you're an innocent spouse. There's all kinds of different alternatives. And the appeals office has to consider any collection alternative offered by the taxpayer. So you have an opportunity to go into the appeals office with a plan that says, look it, guys, let's consider an alternative here. Yes, I owe the money, but here's how I want to work it out in some reasonable way that doesn't involve grinding me into powder. And the appeals office has an affirmative duty to do that. Now, here's another critically important part of the collection due process right that I'm talking about here. If you can't come to terms with the appeals office, if for some reason you're dealing with an appeals officer that's unreasonable or belligerent, which is, it's possible, it's not likely, but it happens, you have the right to go to the United States Tax Court. You got judicial appeal rights that give you the leverage to go to the United States Tax Court. And when the IRS knows that you have that leverage, when the appeals people know you have that leverage, they are far more likely to be reasonable than if you are dealing with collection where you have no leverage. So, Bob, it is so important for people to read the notices that they get. Don't panic when you get a letter from the IRS. Sit down. Be calm about it. Read the notice. Understand what they're talking about. And if you're not sure, get counsel so that you can get guidance from somebody who's got experience that can walk you through the process of dealing with these guys.
It's interesting when just listening to you talk through all of this, and I actually started thinking, and people listening today are thinking, you mean I can put this in motion just by signing my name? And literally, you can put this into motion. And tell me this: you've written so many books about the dealing with the IRS. What's probably the best book that you've written that goes into this in the most detail?
Well, are we talking about the collection
Yeah,
process?
the collection
That
process.
book would be, that book would be my book, How to Get Tax Amnesty. Now, the book How to Get Tax Amnesty, Bob, was originally published in 1992, right? So that's over 30 years ago, right? That book has gone through 9 different revisions. It's helped hundreds of thousands of people across the country. And that is the book that actually created the tax resolution industry as we know it today. The industry of tax resolution did not exist before that book was released. And so I essentially created the industry.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about communicating with the IRS, because this has been a real tough one. You know, people, listeners come in, they listen to what you have to say once a month, and we're talking about stories of all this mail just sitting in these big bins outside, locked up outside of the IRS, talking about 5 to 6 hours waiting on the phone to try to talk to them. What is the best way to communicate?
Well, the best way to communicate is in writing, and that seems to contradict what you just said, where we've heard the stories of the mail sitting in bins in the IRS's service centers around the country. The IRS has worked through that backlog, Bob. To their credit, they finally got themselves on top of the mountain here. They're no longer dealing with millions of tax returns and millions of letters that are piled up backlog. They've gotten through all that. So the communication process with the IRS has pretty much normalized here now. Now that we're in the middle of 2023, right?
Right.
This madness, this insanity started in the middle of 2020, and you'll recall that the IRS shut down. I believe it was about May of 2020 when the federal government started shutting down. Everybody was shutting down because of the COVID thing, and the IRS shutdown continued for about roughly 8 weeks. And then they came back at partial services, and so in the meantime, their computers were still running, their computers were still generating notices, so people were still getting letters, and so people are still responding to letters, and all that stuff was literally going into shipping containers and mail bins and shipping containers that were stacked up in the parking lots of the service centers around the country, the mail centers around the country. It was really a bleak story there for a while. And even though the IRS got fully back to work, probably first quarter of 2021, it took them 2 years to dig out from underneath that pile. And so the bottom line for listeners, what the takeaway is here for listeners is you need to deal with the IRS in writing. All right, you need to, particularly if we're talking about this final notice letter that I was mentioning a minute ago. You got to mail the request for hearing. Has got to be sent in within 30 days. Where you can't call them up and say I want a hearing. You got to request the hearing in writing. So people need to deal with the IRS in writing, and this is true not just of the final notice letter, but if you're seeking penalty relief, a lot of people recognize that they owe the tax, but the penalties and interest are oppressive and probably not even applicable to the case. Okay, I owe the tax, but I made an honest mistake. Why should I be penalized? And so people challenge penalties. That's got to be done in writing too. You can't just call up the IRS and say, I'll pay the tax, but I want the penalties reduced. Can you do something about the penalties? Well, on the phone they'll tell you every single time, well, no, we can't. But the fact is they can reduce penalties, and that's a process that has to be executed in writing with a very detailed penalty abatement request that provides very specific, very detailed facts and circumstances that justify reasons why the IRS should cancel the penalties.
If you want more information on Dan, taxhelponline.com. You'll go to that site, you'll find all of his books and some great free resources on taxhelponline.com. Let's talk a little bit about the other side of all this. You get the IRS letters, you don't want to open them, so you just throw them in a drawer and hope that they go away. And knowing that they're important because that lets you know what's going to happen next, which I think people really got to understand that the IRS just doesn't take an action without warning you first. Talk about why it's so dangerous to ignore the IRS. Well,
people say, or people do what you just described, Bob. They throw them in a box or they throw them in a drawer, hoping they'll go away. And I was thinking you were going to make the next statement, but you didn't. Okay, that's fine. I'll make it. Knowing they won't go away. Right? I'm going to throw the stuff in the drawer, hoping it'll go away. But deep down inside, I know darn well it's not going to just go away. And this is the message that people need to hear: is the stuff doesn't just go away. And so what the risk is that you take, and this is a very serious risk. In fact, it's a deadly risk when it comes to IRS, deadly financially, I mean, and that is this: you lose your rights, Bob. You know, when they send you these notices have deadlines in them, and every right that you have as a taxpayer is time sensitive. So this final notice I was talking about of just a minute ago, that carries a 30-day deadline. You've got 30 days from the date of that notice in which to request a hearing. If you don't request a hearing within 30 days, you lose your right to the hearing. That means now the IRS can enforce collection with levies and seizures and so on. And you don't have any tax court appeal rights anymore because you blew that deadline. And, you know, there are certain things you can do to get your case in front of appeals. Okay, fine. But now because the deadline has been blown, the appeals office is not mandated by law to stop collection, and nor are they mandated by law to give you an opportunity to go to the tax court because you can't. All right, so that's just one example. There's another very, very important example here, Bob, and that is with audit results. You know, a lot of people that go through a tax audit, they get letters from the auditor that they ignore. One of those letters is called a notice of deficiency. A notice of deficiency is a final administrative determination that the IRS issues in an audit case that says we think you owe money. All right, so Bob, you go through an audit. Jane and Joe Smith go through an audit. They get a bill from the IRS that says you owe $30,000, but here's your notice of deficiency. Well, if you don't respond to that notice of deficiency, that tax liability becomes assessed by default. Mm-hmm. All right, the notice of deficiency is your ticket to the tax court. This is your opportunity to challenge the administrative determination before it becomes final. And it's your opportunity to challenge it without having to spend a dime in taxes to do it. In other words, you don't have to pay the tax first to challenge it. You don't have to put a deposit down. You don't have to pay a percentage. You just have to file a petition with the United States Tax Court. The filing fee with the tax court is $60, Bob. And so now you file your case in the tax court. You're going to get an appeals office intervention. So you're going to get an opportunity to negotiate with the appeals people, like I talked about earlier. And you're going to have an opportunity to talk with an IRS attorney to get some resolution there if under the circumstances. And worst case scenario, you have a chance to tell it to a judge. But you lose all of those opportunities if you don't respond to the notice of deficiency on time. So the critical message that people need to hear is that every single one of your rights as a taxpayer is time sensitive. And when you don't act within the time frame, you lose your right, and the right is gone, and it can't be resurrected. So it's critical to track these notices and respond properly. And again, as I said before, if you're not sure what to do, don't do nothing. Don't fail to take any action. Get help, get counsel, get guidance.
You know what? Another piece of advice to go along with that is that if you move, make sure that you do a change of address so they know how to get a hold of you. That's a bad situation where your mail's not even getting to you and you're not having a chance to read it.
Oh yeah, you're exactly right, and it doesn't, and that's a good point, Bob. And that blindsides a lot of people who move. And here's what the rule is: the IRS only has to mail a letter to the taxpayer's last known address. Now, the last known address is a legal definition, all right? It's the address on the most recently filed tax return or an address that the taxpayer provides notice to the IRS that the address has changed. Now, here's where the confusion comes in. People move all the time. We're a very transient society, as you know. People are moving all the time, and that's fine. And what they do when they move is they go over to the post office and they file the change of address form with the post office, and they put in their forwarding order. Now, if the IRS mails a letter to your old address and the post office got the forwarding order in place and the letter gets bounced to your new address, okay, fine. And that happens pretty routinely. But what happens when the forwarding order runs out?
Yep.
Or what happens when the post office messes up and doesn't forward your mail? All right, the IRS mails it to the last known address. As far as they're concerned, that's all they have to do. They don't have to track you down. So here's the thing. Now notice what I said about the definition of last known address. It's the address on your most recently filed tax return or the address that you notify the IRS has changed. All right, the IRS has an address change form. It's Form 8822, 8822. Listeners need to write that down. It is not sufficient under the law to put in a change of address with the post office to notify the IRS of your address change. You have to specifically notify the agency through their Form 8822 that you have a new address, or as far as they're concerned, you don't have a new address.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. IRS expert Dan Pilla on the program every month. Usually we try to get you in here on the second Wednesday of each month, and you're very great. We're so grateful to have you come in. And talk a little bit about, you've already mentioned it, I want to go a little bit deeper on this. Talk about how, from an individual standpoint, you can deal with those penalties. Obviously, when you owe taxes, you've got penalties on top of interest and excessive interest at that. And you can get a little bit of relief on the penalty side, but most people don't know how that works.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you know, there's 140 different penalty provisions in the tax code, Bob. They penalize everything. But the most common ones are the delinquency penalties: failure to file, failure to pay. Let's just stick with failure to file and failure to pay. And that's a penalty that is up for failure to file. It's 5% a month. For any part of a month, the return is late up to 5 months or 25%. And the failure to pay penalty is 1% a month up to 25 months for a max of 25%. So if you're late with your return filing and your tax payment, you can be penalized up to 50% plus the interest, which doubles or triples the tax liability. And people wonder why. I mean, I've heard people tell me 1,000 times, I can pay my taxes. It's the penalties and interest that are killing me.
Right.
And that's the reason for it. Every single penalty provision of the tax code has what's called a good faith or reasonable cause provision. And what it means very simply is if you acted in good faith and based on reasonable cause for your actions and didn't deliberately disregard IRS rules and regulations, the penalties don't apply. The penalties apply when the failure is due to intentional disregard or conscious indifference to your deliberate indifference to your tax responsibilities. All right, so you'd have to be a person that would wake up one morning and say to themselves, how can I tick off the IRS today? I know I'm going to stop filing my tax returns and paying my taxes. That'll teach them. That's the kind of behavior that is envisioned with this intentional disregard or willful indifference to a person's responsibilities. Most people are behind through no fault of their own, right? They got in trouble through some natural disaster, fire, flood, hurricane, personal disaster, catastrophic illness, injury, failed business, failed marriage, drug or alcohol problems or COVID or any of these kinds of things that operate to throw a curveball in a person's life is generally how they got behind on their taxes. Well, if you can establish with the IRS that your failure was not due to intentional disregard, but was due to some unforeseen circumstance beyond your control, you can get rid of the penalties. The penalties do not apply. All right? And so when you're seeking penalty relief, you have to write a letter to the IRS that provides a very detailed description of the facts and circumstances of your case that establish reasonable cause, and when you can persuade the IRS that you did not deliberately disregard your responsibilities, but your failures were due to these circumstances beyond your control, they will cancel the penalties, and then they cancel the interest on the penalties, and that reduces the tax liability considerably.
Well, you know what's going to happen. We're going to have to continue this to next month because I only got about a third of the questions that I want to cover with you. So great information, though, Dan. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
It's my pleasure, Bob. Thanks for having me, and goodbye to all your listeners.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. My favorite book that he's written is called The IRS Problem Solver, and if I recall, there is a letter in that book that tells you exactly what to write to the IRS. So taxhelponline.com is where you'd go. If you have a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.